Hey everybody, it's Kyle Fireman here, and today I'm going to be talking to you about another cryptocurrency related topic, and it's the Mt. Gox Heist. Well, this Mt. Gox Heist, it's very infamous in the cryptocurrency world because it's the biggest theft in the cryptocurrency world, and one of the biggest thefts, period. One of the biggest thefts in the history of history. There were 850,000 Bitcoins stolen, that's 750,000 customer Bitcoins, and so at a price of 4,000 Bitcoin, that's the current price, that's over $3 billion stolen. That's absolutely massive. Now, the price of Bitcoin at the time was much lower, so the theft was, closer to like 500 million or, 700 million, but it's still a massive theft. So what I'm going to talk to you guys today about is not so much about the theft itself, but potentially who was behind it and why why I think that, and their sort of connections and how they're all related. The one thing I want to talk about is that none of these are all sort of I guess you could call them sort of conspiratorial in that I don't have proof of them, but the Mt. Gox heist did happen, and so the question is who did it and how did they do it. So I'm just going to talk about everyone who has been sort of related to the Mt. Gox heist and how. And the way I'm going to talk about this is sort of a chronological order of what Mt. Gox and company said happened, and then basically what happened afterwards, just how everything played out. So originally, when they said that heist occurred, the Mt. Gox company, they said the way that it had occurred was through transaction malleability. Now, I'm not going to talk about the complete specifics in transaction malleability, but basically that was a bug in the Bitcoin software that had been known for a very long time. It was a bug that did not affect normal, like, private users. It only affected operators of exchanges. So Mt. Gox was the biggest exchange. As the biggest exchange, they should have known about this. It was a very easy bug, not to fall prey to, because basically what would happen is in every Bitcoin transaction, there's some non-essential information, and the transaction malleability bug would allow you to change some of the non-essential information in a transaction so that it would either be accepted or denied in such a way that the software that the exchange would run on would misread the blockchain, and then that would cause the exchange software to send bitcoins where they weren't supposed to be. So it wasn't so much a bug on the side of Bitcoin, but it would just make reading the blockchain a little different, because the data, some of the non-essential data would be changed, and so that's how the sort of bug would work. The problem with what Mt. Gox said was you would have to be completely incompetent in order to lose 850,000 Bitcoin to transaction malleability. Like, if you started losing some coins to transaction malleability, it should basically be instantly obvious. You should figure it out very quickly just by doing some basic accounting. So originally, when Mark Karpalez came out with the transaction malleability claim, there were basically two camps in sort of the interpretation of what had happened. The first camp said Mark Karpalez is an idiot, and the second camp said Mark Karpalez had stolen from everybody. The Mark Karpalez is an idiot, that's probably one of the better explanations of what has actually happened. A lot of the blame actually should be laid on the person who first made the exchange, Jed McCaleb. A lot of it was his fault, but he didn't know how big Bitcoin would be, so he was just kind of in the wrong place at the wrong time. Both of them really kind of screwed up and were in over their heads, but that's just the way it was. But anyways, after this transaction malleability claim, everybody basically knew it wasn't transaction malleability, and it couldn't have been transaction malleability, so everyone knew Mark Karpalez was lying. The question was, is he lying because he's trying to cover his tracks, or did he have some sort of FBI gag order in order to, let them carry out their investigation? He had actually contacted people, or people had contacted Mark Karpalez, and he said he wasn't talking about it so that they could carry on their investigation. So it seems that's what he was trying to do, but you never know. Obviously, if he's trying to cover his tracks, he's just going to be silent anyways, so nobody really knows at this point. But anyways, a few weeks after the heist had happened, Mt. Gox found 200,000 Bitcoin in an old wallet that they just had forgot about, I suppose. That's really, like, I know that sounds stupid what I'm telling you, but that's basically what they said. They said they found 200,000 Bitcoin in an old wallet. So this started bringing up a bunch of questions. You know, where did these Bitcoin come from? Was it part of a stash that Mark Karpalez was keeping for himself, or like were they stolen? Was this evidence of money laundering? This started to make people think that Mark Karpalez, they knew he was an idiot because one, he had Bitcoin, you know, on his own exchange that either he had forgotten about or it was profits from some sort of illicit activity. And the question is, what was it? Was Mark Karpalez involved with illicit activities, or was he just an idiot? You know, what's the real question? So then this is where things really started getting juicy. When Silk Road, this was one of the largest dark web drug marketplaces in existence. It was probably one of the most popular and well-known ones to ever exist. Well, basically, when that whole thing went down, when Silk Road got taken down, there were two corrupt agents named Carl Force and Shaun Bridges. These two corrupt agents were in close contact with Mark Karpalez, and actually it was these two agents who they actually tried to do business with Mark Karpalez with money they had stolen from Silk Road, and Mark Karpalez said he didn't want to do business with him, and like a few months later, both of these agents, I think they worked for the Department of Homeland Security, but both of them they made the Department of Homeland Security go after Mt. Gox, and Mt. Gox actually got visited and had accounts frozen by the Department of Homeland Security a few months later, and Carl Force taunted Mark Karpalez about how he should have done business with him. It's really kind of crazy, all the things these two corrupt agents did. It really reads almost like a James Bond style movie. They actually I think they caught Shaun Bridges on the runway as he was trying to leave the country. Now, the one thing about if you get caught by FBI agents, you know, on the runway, a lot of times they'll try and catch you on the runway to prove you were trying to flee. So that was probably set up, but he literally got caught on the runway. So it literally, like this story, it's so bizarre of Carl Force and Shaun Bridges, and it reads like just some sort of crazy thriller. But anyways, these guys were closely associated with Mark Karpalez as well as with Ross William Ulbricht, and so this sort of brought up a lot of questions. And then when Ross William Ulbricht had his trial, it was revealed that the number one person who they believed to be the Dread Pirate Roberts was actually Mark Karpalez. They believed it to be him for the longest time, and it was only until recently, actually it was once they started talking to Mark Karpalez and they froze his assets, that's when Mark Karpalez decided he gave them the name of an account that was out at Mt. Gox, a huge account, a big account that he suspected that was Ross William Ulbricht's. This account had like 60,000 some Bitcoin in it or something, and it was seized by the FBI. But anyways, so they thought Mark Karpalez was running Silk Road for the longest time, and maybe he was. Maybe that's where that 200,000 Bitcoin came from. Maybe he acted as their one of their money launderers. Who really knows? Nobody really knows at this point. But all that is known is that there are a lot of connections with Silk Road. The next weird connection is Craig Wright, the man who cried Nakamoto. And what I mean by this is Craig Wright was a guy who came out and said he was the inventor of Bitcoin. And he tried to come out and prove it, but he didn't actually have any proof. He didn't have any proof whatsoever. In fact, I'm going to put the links to a lot of different articles below where you'll just see him try, like, they're all written articles. It's not like videos, but you'll read articles about this guy Craig Wright trying to prove that he was the creator of Bitcoin, and he freaks out. It looks like he's having a panic attack. Like he just starts cursing and like he won't stop, and it looks like he's freaking out. And there's a lot of things you can learn from these articles that I have. Some of the transcripts of these things are like 40 pages long, and we'll get into this later, but there's a lot of the reason why this is very important for the case is because, or for Mt. Gox, and because a lot of people will be like, Craig Wright didn't invent Bitcoin, he's a nobody. Well, Craig Wright has a lot of documentation saying that he has 1.1 million Bitcoin. He also has a lot of troubles with the Australian tax authorities in regard to these Bitcoin, and he says he has this company set up, and it's really weird in this article, but he said he has to move a lot of Bitcoin around for the company, and the way that he's talking to the Australian tax authority is that it seems like he was in trouble for basically money laundering with Bitcoin. But if he's not the guy, and like everyone believes that Craig Wright is not the guy who made Bitcoin, if he's not the guy who made Bitcoin, but he has this 1.1 million Bitcoin stash that he's been moving around, that he has trouble with, or that he's having issues with the Australian tax authorities now, where did he get that Bitcoin? I mean, if you think about like huge investors in the Bitcoin sphere, you think about people like the Winklevoss twins. Well, the Winklevoss twins have something like 144,000 Bitcoin or something. It's something like that. This guy Craig Wright says he has 1.1 million. Then he also says he has access to USB drives of friends like Dave Kleiman, who has like 500,000 Bitcoin or 300,000 Bitcoin. Like, it's ridiculous the amount of Bitcoin that Craig Wright pretends to have access to. And does he actually have access to these sort of Bitcoin, or is he just making this up? The one thing that everybody knows true about Craig Wright is that he's a con man. The question is what is he trying to con people about? And I'm going to make the case that it's potentially, like, it's a potentiality, I guess I should say, that he actually could be somebody who bought a lot of stolen Mt. Gox coins. You know, he would have bought them at a discount, and he's holding on to them just to get rid of them at a later time. But you don't really know. You'd have to figure out what wallets he holds and things of that nature. But then finally, we're going to talk about Alexander Vinnik and the Russian connection. So they actually traced the Mt. Gox coins, and they were able to figure out who laundered the coins, and it was a guy named Alexander Vinnik, who is closely associated with the Bitcoin e-exchange, and we'll talk about that a lot later. But it was actually Russian hackers in the case of Mt. Gox that stole everything. So any Mt. Gox users out there that are wondering where their coins went, if you hadn't seen this already, you can blame the loss of your money on Russian hackers. Unlike Hillary Clinton, you won't be lying if you say it. But anyways, let's go ahead and talk about this original transaction malleability claim by Mark Karpala's and Mt. Gox. Well, like I said before, you can't steal coins with transaction malleability. You can only trick an exchange, but if you trick the exchange, you know, that should become very obvious very quickly because just of basic accounting procedures. If someone were to trick the exchange as soon as they do a double entry accounting, everything should be accounted for correctly. Everything would not be accounted for correctly, and so they should know something is up. So you cannot steal coins unless the person does not do accounting whatsoever. So it brought up the question, is Karpala is totally incompetent? Like I said, a lot of people believe that. A lot of people believe that. That's the number one theory for what happened with Mt. Gox. The things I'm going to talk to you about, or that I have already talked to you about, they're a little bit more conspiratorial because there's not any necessary proof of these things, but these are just bad actors that could have had a lot of opportunity to be involved in this heist. But do I think Karpala was potentially involved in the heist? I don't think he was involved in stealing from his own company. Do I think that the 200,000 Bitcoin he found could be illicit profits he's gained for his connections with Silk Road and other dark web activities? Absolutely. That's absolutely what I think it could be. The other thing about this transaction malleability thing is Karpala has said that he had 90% of his coins in cold storage. Now, there's a lot of rumors that he was an idiot, like I said, that he was incompetent. So there were some people who were saying that some of his cold storage wallets, like he said, he could access them behind a firewall, which would mean they weren't actually cold storage. So some people said he didn't know what he was talking about, but any coins he had in cold storage should have been safe. The issue is, like, we'll get to this in the Russian connection, but the issue is what somebody actually did was they stole an old wallet.dat file, which is basically, once, like, if you have the wallet.dat file, you've got all the coins, and they stole it at a time early enough in Bitcoin's architecture that they could cover up the theft, and it wouldn't look like they stole it until years later. So that's how they said they did it. But I mean, it's still hard to sort of believe. I really want to see some more info released on it, but because the investigation is ongoing, they're not really releasing anything. But if they had coins in cold storage, those should be safe, and they had over 90% of their coins in cold storage. Mt. Gox did. So they should have had that much safe, so it was really a surprise when they said that they had lost 850,000 Bitcoin. Anyways, moving on again to that 200,000 Bitcoin they found, that raised huge questions. Again, and it was the stash illicit, or was Karpala's incompetent? The major theory for if Mark Karpala's was incompetent was that he just lost the private keys to some of his wallets, and then he could only remember part of the password, and so he was just trying to figure it out through basically brute force attacks. So that isn't actually what happened. That's what it seems like. That's not what happened. That doesn't explain this wallet. Nobody knows exactly how Mark Karpala just forgot about 200,000 Bitcoin. But again, this brought up questions, or it raised questions with his connections with people in the dark web. And one thing you have to know about Bitcoin was when Bitcoin started, like 80 to 90% of its transactions were involved with basically illicit transactions, drug transactions, things of that nature, like when it first started. One of the people who actually started or made Bitcoin huge was Ross William Ulbricht, by starting the Silk Road website, and he advertised for Bitcoin through that website and things of that nature. Once Bitcoin got started and had value, like as of right now, most of the transactions are completely legal. You know, there's nothing wrong with most of the transactions, but it did start off that way. So there were a lot of people that Mark Karpala was really close with too, that were also close with people in the dark web. Mark Karpala was very close with this guy named Charlie Shrem, who was on house arrest for like 5 years or something. But and Mark Karpala had already been arrested once as I think he was a teenager, for like money laundering using internet currency. So you know, it was sort of his crowd, I guess you could say, doing sort of illegal things with digital monies. I'm not saying he's a bad guy. I think he was more so caught in the wrong place at the wrong time for at least the theft here. Maybe he did. I do think like this 200,000 Bitcoin he found, like that does maybe indicate that maybe he was doing some sort of money laundering work, but honestly, I don't really give a shit about that. My question is did he steal from me, or was he incompetent, and did he let my coins get stolen from me? That's what I really want to know, and the question seems to be yes, so that's what I really don't like this guy for. But anyways, moving on, beyond just, you know, they found a bunch of Bitcoin. What do those Bitcoin mean? Well, this is again where things get real juicy, the Silk Road connections. Agent Shaun Bridges and Agent Carl Force, both of them were in close contact with Mark Karpala at different times, and they would threaten Mark, or they would try and do business with him. They would just do a lot of weird, shady things. Those guys are a bunch of weirdos. But anyways, they were involved in the Silk Road investigation, and they were involved in the Mt. Gox investigation. They were involved in both, and so that raises a lot of questions, having corrupt cops and both investigations at once. And like I said, they thought Mark Karpala, the head of Mt. Gox, ran Silk Road. Everybody thought that in the investigation until a few months before Mark Karpala ended up deciding that, hey, I'm going to give you the head of Silk Road because I think he's one of these guys at my exchanges. And that's one of the ways that they found Ross William Ulbricht. But another thing about the Silk Road connections is not only did Mt. Gox say that they suffered a malleability attack, but Silk Road number 2, like Silk Road tried to restart after Ross William Ulbricht was arrested, and this one got shut down too, but Silk Road 2 claimed that it got stolen from by a malleability attack as well. This isn't necessarily anything big, other than it seems to indicate that there were a lot of malleability attacks going on at that time, and if there was someone connected, like these people, Shaun Bridges and Carl Force, knew a lot about Bitcoin, and they were closely associated with this exchange and this illegal Silk Road marketplace. Well, if they knew the right people and put the right people in the right places, maybe they were the ones who, had both of the thefts occur, because both of these thefts were very similar. And the one thing you'll find out about the Russian connection later on is that a lot of these thefts, they all went through Bitcoin E. They were all laundered through this guy, Alexander Vinnik, who used a Bitcoin E wallet and account. And so if all of these thefts are getting laundered through the same person, potentially it could be all an organization of people, but you never really know for sure. Anyways, like I said, Mark Karpala has offered DPR, that's the Dread Pirate Roberts. He's the person who ran Silk Road. He offered him to the U.S. authorities when U.S. authorities froze Mt. Gox's accounts, and I'm assuming that the U.S. authorities may have told Mark Karpala or threatened him at the time, saying they thought he was the Dread Pirate Roberts, and that's why he caved in and said, oh, no, I'm not, I'll give you the real Dread Pirate Roberts. Nobody really knows exactly what happened during that case or during those talks, but again, there's a lot of really weird connections in there. Our next weird connection is Craig Wright, the false Nakamoto. So Craig Wright tried to say he was Satoshi Nakamoto. Well, like, everyone basically shut him down super hard. If you look at, like, the only information indicating that he could have been was all information he leaked. Basically, he's not the kind of person anyways that would have been capable of it. He was close friends with a guy named Dave Kleiman, and this guy Dave Kleiman would have had the ability to have created Bitcoin, but we know that Dave Kleiman did not, because all the information indicating that Dave Kleiman could have been the creator of Bitcoin came from Craig Wright, and we know Craig Wright is lying. But anyways, the reason why Craig Wright is brought into this whole Mt. Gox Silk Road fiasco is because Craig Wright came out saying he was the creator of Bitcoin. Now, if you're the creator of Bitcoin, you will also be, or you had at 1.1 million Bitcoin. A lot of people think the creator has already sold off some of his Bitcoin privately, and he probably holds quite a bit right now, but people don't think he holds that 1 million all to himself anymore. But anyways, this guy Craig Wright, who came out and said he was the creator of Bitcoin, he also had documents claiming that he was the holder of about 1.1 million Bitcoin, which sounds about right for if you were the creator of Bitcoin. But if he was proven, or if he didn't have any proof that he was the creator of Bitcoin, and he could have proved it very simply just by moving some of these Bitcoin, then if he's not the creator of Bitcoin, how does he have this 1.1 million Bitcoin? The question that goes hand in hand with that is, does he actually have this much Bitcoin? And one thing that you have to understand about this is, and I'll put the link in the description below, and there's a lot of weird articles on this, and I'll put all these articles below, but especially the ones on Craig Wright, because these Craig Wright ones are very interesting and very weird. But there's a couple things with Craig Wright. First, he had tax troubles related to his movement of Bitcoin, and what basically had happened was he claimed he ran some sort of company, and he used Bitcoin as basically intercompany transactions, and anyways, some of his transactions were really weird. He paid like 150,000 Bitcoin for computer code to run a Bitcoin exchange. I don't think code for a Bitcoin exchange would cost, at the time, I think it was something like 55 million or 35 million, something way up there. But, I don't think you need to pay 25 to 30 million for code to run an exchange. But then he also tried to pay like 18 million for gold ore. And when he tried to pay for the gold ore, the thing that was super interesting about the gold ore was he didn't get the gold ore. So he filed some sort of criminal complaint. Craig Wright filed a criminal complaint against the Australian Tax Service, basically, that he should get a tax refund for getting stolen from, basically. But then he ended up dropping the complaint. So This was like 100,000 Bitcoin he sent. It was like 18 million worth of Bitcoin. Let me ask you a question. If you were stolen from in the amount of 18 million worth of Bitcoin, would you just drop it? And he basically just dropped it. And that was their problem with that, was that when they dropped it, um, Craig Wright, and there's this one article that's like 40 pages of this meeting with different tax advisors, and there's a couple things you'll learn from it. One, it seems that Craig Wright is actually trying to argue that he shouldn't have any sort of meeting with the tax authorities because since he dropped the claim, they can't like review any of his financials. So that's interesting if he's trying to hide his financials from the tax authorities who would actually be helping him in the case if he had been stolen from. So it seems like he's telling these people to just go fuck off, which is very interesting because if he was actually stolen from, they could actually help him. But if he wasn't stolen from, then it's just because he doesn't want them to look at his financial information. But the other thing too is you'll listen to what's going on in these, and Craig's a bit of a megalomaniac. And what I mean by that is at one point they start talking about Bitcoin, and then it's Craig's lawyer is talking about Bitcoin, and then Craig's lawyer, it's this guy named Summer or something like that. But anyways, he looks over to Craig and he says, "Did I explain that right?" And Craig looks at him, or it doesn't say what they're looking at, but you can tell basically the expression on Craig's face just from what he says. And what he says, he's like, "Well, that's almost right, but the question of how right it is depends on what level we're talking about." He's like, "Are we talking about on your level or my level?" And by that, he's just saying, like, I'm on a different level of Bitcoin because I'm its creator. And if you know anything about the creator of Bitcoin, from his original messages, he was a very humble guy. He didn't think that much of Bitcoin. He just was like, when he talked about Bitcoin, he didn't think it was this revolutionary thing. He was just like, I think it's just better than what exists out there already. That's it. That's all he thought about Bitcoin. And this Craig Wright guy, like, I don't know, this Craig Wright guy is really weird when he's talking and stuff. And like I said, these articles on Craig Wright make it almost seem like he's trying to cover up his transaction, like the movements of money that he does through Bitcoin. And he's trying not to have these authorities to look at it. But again, if he does have 1 million Bitcoin, where the hell did he get it? Because if he's not the creator of Bitcoin itself, if he's not Satoshi Nakamoto, basically the only person who would have access to 1 million Bitcoin is whoever has access to all of the coins that were laundered by our next guy, the next person we're going to talk about, our Russian hacker, Alexander Vinnik. Now, Alexander Vinnik, he is convicted of running a $4 billion Bitcoin laundering operation in Bitcoin E. So that's over 1 million Bitcoin. Obviously, you got to know he's not holding on to $4 billion worth of Bitcoin. That's just how much he's, laundered throughout his career, I guess you could say. But this gets very interesting because if you actually look at the creation date too of Bitcoin E, it started about the time that the coins from Mt. Gox were being stolen, and basically all of the coins from Mt. Gox moved through Bitcoin E. Now, that's not to say that all of Bitcoin E was stolen Mt. Gox coins, but a large majority of it probably was, and this is very interesting, especially because the U.S. Has tried to it's tried to seize servers of Bitcoin E, and to some extent it has to have succeeded because 45% of their funds have been seized by U.S. authorities. So how much information do these U.S. authorities know about Bitcoin E and their connection with Alexander Vinnik and his connection with these Mt. Gox coins that he laundered? Nobody really knows, but we do know that Alexander Vinnik is the guy who laundered the coins. It's hard still to prove a launderer was the launderer. Like, everyone knows they went through wallets associated with him. They're still trying to prove in court whether or not he was criminally responsible. But just from listening to his arrests, like what he said in his arrests, he seems like a megalomaniac, like this Craig Wright guy, and so he seems to not really, or seems to be a criminal, to be honest, kind of. But I don't really know. But anyways, they wouldn't have seized his funds unless they had something on him. But again, this is sort of the Mt. Gox theory, or not necessarily theory, but conspiracy. What exactly happened? Well, nobody really knows, but what we do know is that 850,000 bitcoins were stolen. The reason that was given for it was transaction malleability, and this was a lie. So they lied about why or how the bitcoins were stolen. Later on, 200,000 Bitcoin were just simply found in an old wallet. It was never explained how they were found. It was never explained if it was the incompetence of the owner, Mark Karpales, or if it was illicit activities that he had been involved in. Nobody really said. They just said we found it, and everyone accepted it at that. So that's another thing that's really weird with the Mt. Gox Heist. Now, the third thing that's really weird with the Mt. Gox Heist is the Silk Road connections. The connections with Carl Force and Shaun Bridges, the two corrupt agents who not only had stolen from Silk Road, laundered their money through Bitcoin E, but also tried to do business with Mark Karpales, and then after Mark Karpales rejected them, they brought the heat of the DHS on Mt. Gox. So the fourth and probably the weirdest thing in the Mt. Gox connection is Craig Wright, the man who potentially holds on to 1.1 million Bitcoin of his own and about 300,000 Bitcoin of a friend's. This is a very weird question because nobody knows how he would have access to those unless he was a creator of Bitcoin. Another interesting connection between Craig Wright and Silk Road is a guy named Variety Jones, and the reason why he is an interesting person in this whole saga is because Craig Wright said that this guy named Dan Kleiman was holding on to about 300,000 Bitcoins. But the story that Craig Wright makes no sense because Craig Wright or Dan Kleiman was super sick near his death, and if he had 300,000 Bitcoins, he would have had like $50 million. It would have been a huge amount of money, and he could have used that to pay for his care in hospitals, but he didn't. So the question is, does Craig Wright actually hold on to those Bitcoin for Dan Kleiman, or was that just completely made up? Nobody knows. But how that can lead into another connection with Silk Road is there's this guy named Variety Jones who was recently arrested, and he was a mentor to Ross William Ulbricht, the owner of Silk Road, and the FBI had been hounding Variety Jones for quite a long time about a Bitcoin wallet with 350,000 or so Bitcoin in it. And so the reason why, again, I have that connection there is Variety Jones is being hounded by the FBI of a wallet that has 300 or so thousand Bitcoins in it. Well, Craig Wright says there's a guy, or that he was friends with a guy that has a wallet that has 300,000 or so Bitcoin in it. There are very few wallets in the world that have 300,000 Bitcoin in them. I don't know if there actually are any that have 300,000 in one single wallet. They might have it through a couple of wallets like that are all on one USB or something like that, but 300,000 Bitcoin, that's a huge number of Bitcoin. So that's, again, if there are two people talking about Bitcoin wallets with 300,000 in them, there's a good chance that those are the same wallets, just because like statistically speaking, there's only so many Bitcoin, so there's only so many wallets that can have 300,000 in them. So is that wallet that Craig Wright says Dan Kleiman is, or it says is Dan Kleiman's, is that the same wallet that Variety Jones is talking about, or are both of those stories complete bullshit? Nobody really knows. Again, this Mt. Gox heist is really weird. The one thing we do know, the one thing that is valid, the one thing that has been proven is that the coins were laundered through an account used by Alexander Vinnick, and they were laundered through Bitcoin E. Again, all of these Bitcoins, like 850,000 of them, plus quite a few more, were laundered through Bitcoin E and through this Russian guy, Alexander Vinnick. So that's what we do know. The question is, who else was involved? Alexander Vinnick was the launderer. Who was the thief? Who is the person who bought the coins from the launderer? Is that person who bought the coins from the launderer Craig Wright? Was Mark Karpales the original launderer for the dark web, but then once he was found out by police, did that move over to Alexander Vinnick? Obviously, if we're talking about Mark Karpales, could have been a launderer for the dark web, but Alexander Vinnick was obviously a launderer for the stolen Mt. Gox coins. it's just a very interesting question. A lot of these people seem to be involved in criminal activities. The question is who's doing what when, and who's doing what when, where, and with whom. There's a lot of questions there that nobody really knows. But this is one of the most interesting stories just anywhere. It's one of the most interesting investigations in probably this century, and nobody really knows anything about what has happened whatsoever. So let me know what you think in the comments. Do you think that Mark Karpalez was involved? Do you think Jed McCaleb was involved? Do you think those two corrupt agents, Shaun Bridges and Carl Force, were involved? What about Variety Jones, the mentor to Ross William Ulbricht? Was Ross William Ulbricht involved? Was Craig Wright one of these? Is he holding on to some of these bitcoins from the Mt. Gox users? Honestly, I have no idea. The one thing that I do know is that Alexander Vinnick was the launderer. That's the one thing we do know, and that's the only thing we do know. But hopefully we'll figure it out eventually, because this is billions of dollars that there are customers out there that are waiting to get their money back, and so hopefully we'll figure it out for them. So anyways, I'll have more videos on these topics and topics like this coming up, so stay tuned.